Hey there, folks. Pedantic Skeptic here. We are now in part 5 of the Cornerstone Church's Apologetics Session 35, Origins and Evolution Part 2. I don't know if this is going to be a 6 or 7 part thing. I doubt we're going to finish at part 5. But anyway, we're going through some of the claims these guys are making and explaining why they are incorrect about genetics, evolution, and things like that. So, without further ado, let's just jump right in. Wait a minute. No, I'm not even worried. Okay.
Because the genome is a real problem
No, it's not, actually.
for evolutionists. But I mean, they're not hiding the ball, right? They laid it all out, just like I laid it out, right? They laid it all out and still said, "Yep, we're descended from them." I mean, this
We share a common ancestor with them.
was shocking to me when I saw it. So I had to play it for everyone because, again, coming from their own lips, right?
So Matt, is that video targeted to school-age children?
Probably.
So right then and there, they're already starting to indoctrinate.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I should say is when something is targeted towards school-age children, and I'm assuming they're, meaning like middle school and younger, it's going to be a vast oversimplification because a brain that young can't really grasp, some of these things. But aren't they doing the same thing if they're trying to teach their small children about, creationism, God, Jesus, all that stuff?
What their belief system is going to be.
And most children, I mean, this is not a slight to anyone, but most children are not going to grow up to be scientists, right?
It depends on what you define as a scientist, but I would say that is correct.
There's a set of people who are intellectually curious and are interested in STEM fields, and there are people who want to write, poetry or fix cars, right? Mm-hmm. And so most people are not going to invest any time in doing any research on this. They're going to take what the really brainy science people say as fact and move on with their lives.
So, sorry, there's something in my throat. One of the things I should say about that is that, depending on the state and depending on the grade and things like that, the students going through public schools and even private schools are held to certain standards of understanding various disciplines, including science and social studies and math, English, and language arts, things like that. And basically need to have a certain competency in these areas. So it's not just, well, they're just going to, be told this, simple scientific thing, and then they're going to be, blindly believing it. It is, they are required to understand the process as a whole, learn how to evaluate arguments and evidence. Some of these standards, at least in Colorado and from the National Science Education people, I'm forgetting the acronym for them, but they lay out, like, one of the things you have to be competent in as a public school student who's, about to graduate high school, is you have to at least be familiar with how data is collected and how evidence works and how to evaluate sources and, 10 other things. It's not just you're blindly taught to accept evolutionary theory. You're taught how to work through, what the theory says and how we know it and how to evaluate and, kind of think through the evidence for yourself. And when you get into college, if you go to a college, it's somewhat similar where you have to have at least familiarity with things that aren't related to your major. So they have, like gen eds where, everybody who goes through college, no matter what their major is, has to take a culture course. They have to take maybe a religion, or they may have to take an English writing course, things like that. So they require this so that it's not, it's not just people blindly accepting one thing over another.
Blame them, because who wants to think about this stuff day in and day out but crazy people like us?
Not only that, Matt, but you keep referring to they,
yes.
And they are not in unanimous agreement about much of anything.
that's perfectly normal for a lot of
No,
disciplines.
and this is something that you'll find shocking. Stephen Meyer tells a story. Stephen Meyer is a Christian. He's a Christian who is also a physicist and scientist. That
Is he going to quote a physicist for something regarding a biological thing?
um, talks about you know he wrote books like Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell. And
So, I'm not going to make a genetic fallacy here, but when you are genuinely trying to understand something in the realm of biology, you should be referring to a biologist, okay? It's not that a physicist can't necessarily be competent in the biological field, but they don't have to be, and you're much better off picking a biologist.
and the rise of the God hypothesis. He actually didn't grow up really as a believing Christian, but really came to belief in God through investigation of some of the science and stuff. And there's lots of really good videos that I have linked in the appendix of this in the references section of some of his stuff. He is really compelling. And
I don't know if I want to trust this guy's definition of compelling.
and, uh, and has really kind of skirted around the issue of God in Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell. He was really more of a proponent of.
Just a moment. I, on my main channel, responded to, hang on, Darwin's Doubt. There was a movie, um, oh, and that wasn't, I responded to some questions for Darwin movie many years ago. But anyway, maybe we'll watch Darwin's Doubt next.
Intelligent design, and really wanted to attack things from a purely scientific and actually use Darwinian, methods for trying to prove that evolution is just really nonsense.
One of the problems there is that we've progressed so much further than Darwin that using, the first person to conceive of this theory is not really a good way of addressing the current theory today.
Use some of their scientific methods for it, but then he finally wrote a book called the Rise of the God Hypothesis, where he said, "Listen, I've been talking about all this intelligent design and avoiding the question of who the designer is. Now let's talk about who the designer is and why that is the best explanation." Rather than things like some of the intelligent design arguments were things around like maybe the Earth was seeded by aliens, right? But when you talk about some of the origin of the universe discussions that we had the last time I was up here, you start saying, okay, well that's what they call an immanent, right, designer. But if you think about the design of the universe itself, it has to be a transcendent.
No, it doesn't.
Designer. So it has to be something outside of the universe, because something inside the universe can't create the universe they exist in. And so that gets to it. So this whole 98%, and I guarantee you, school kids who couldn't tell you who the vice president was or the last president.
That is not a question of science, but
Well, they probably couldn't. The last president was Trump, but they couldn't tell you who the president before that was. They couldn't tell you who the Speaker of the House was. Couldn't tell you why we celebrate the 4th of July. And I'm serious. Like, there are lots of kids on these man on the street interviews who couldn't. They said, we celebrate independence. Independence from who? I'm not sure.
Great Britain.
They couldn't tell you any of that, but they could tell you this 99% number. That's how prevalent it is in school systems and in the media and in Discovery Channel or anything.
I would actually like to see these interviews where that's actually the case. He's saying that, like, if you were to go to random people and ask, hey, who was the last Speaker of the House, and then ask them what's the percentage of DNA we share with chimpanzees. I would like to see exactly like what the proportions of people who know each of those questions actually are. Not just take his word for it.
People know the 98% number, right? But when you actually dig into it, it turns out not to be as simple as all of that, right? When you look at what they do and how they come to that conclusion. This is why I'm always a skeptic when somebody says, well, studies show. Well, which studies? What were the parameters of the studies?
I agree. You need to know things. I mean, like, hopefully a published peer-reviewed study is pretty sound because of the peer review process and how it works. But, for example, quoting really old literature, especially in a field where new information has been gathered, is going to make a difference. And also things like, you know, what was the scope of the study you're quoting versus other studies? If the study was aiming at, hey, what's the development rate of girafsomyron, for example, then can't say much more about girafsomyron or studies on girafsomyron other than this study found that, under these conditions. But if you're looking at, like, what are anti-predatory defenses that girafsomyron larvae employ, or how does, you know, maybe a big picture question like how do grape-feeding sphingids differ in their abundance, or maybe something like how do lepidopterans abundance in nature line up with the abundance of their host plants, broader questions. So you're definitely going to have to kind of know what the person is asserting and know what the studies they are quoting or trying to find.
Who was in the study, right? How did they come about their conclusions? Because you can create a study to tell you anything you want it to.
You can create a study to ask anything you want. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to tell you everything or anything you want. The results are going to be the results.
Right? And so it's really important that you actually look at how the science was done to determine whether or not you can really, abide by it.
So then why hasn't he pulled up the articles that have the methods for the chimp-human DNA comparisons and go through them line by line? I would like to see him do that, because you could do that if you were really concerned about it and you really wanted to do that, and he hasn't done that.
Okay. We have 15 minutes. I'm going to go through the next thing, and then we're going to stop before we get to the origin of first life, which is, I think, the real problem that evolutionists have, right? Because all of what we've talked about presupposes first life existing.
Yes, that's exactly, that is part of that is what evolution addresses. Evolution doesn't address the origin of life. It's never intended to.
So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the next thing I'm going to talk about is something called the Cambrian explosion. So you saw in that video that we just showed the trees, right? You saw that sort of branching trees that they had. They call it the tree of life, right? And it starts at the very base of the trunk of the tree. You start with first life, the first single-celled organisms in the primordial soup that was, I guess, struck by lightning. Billion.
I mean, we don't know the exact process of how, the first amino acids were formed and things like that. I mean, we have some good ideas, but, there are multiple models nowadays, and, we don't know exactly which one it was, but, it's kind of a moot point right now.
Millions of years ago, and a first life evolved, right? And then you saw that simpler life grew to more complex life.
Depends on what you define as simple versus complex, but I'll let that slide.
And that kind evolved into different kinds and so forth, right?
Define kind. Jesus Christ.
And so, again, we talked about the fossil record. We talked about some of the skeletons that they found. That was primarily around human evolution and not all life on the planet evolution. The Cambrian explosion is it's called the Cambrian explosion because it appears in when you go back in time, the Cambrian era, right? So it's this period of time about 500 billion or 500 million rather years ago. About 500 million years ago, there was this fossil record that occurred in the strata in a relatively short period of time geologically. It was around 6 million years of time.
That, compared to how long life has existed, especially multicellular eukaryotic life, that is quite a while. But let's just see. I think Ordovician period was before the Cambrian, or was it before? No, it was actually. Sorry, it was after the Cambrian. Cambrian period. But then you had the Ediacaran period. So actually it's the Ediacaran that had the first multicellular organisms show up. So that is when eukaryotes came about as well. So anyways, back to Cambrian stuff. Let's see.
Where a bunch of new organisms show up in the fossil record. Now, these organisms were like crustaceans and different kinds of organisms, but they had distinct body plans, what they call body plans, which are just their
the outline of the or the arrangement of their bodies.
Their physical characteristics were very different from one another. So some had exoskeletons, some had internal skeletons, some were.
Did he just say that it was a bunch of crustaceans and some had internal skeletons?
Like snails and stuff like that. So they
Snails are not crustaceans. Snails are mollusks.
had very distinct body plans.
Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm being a little hard on this guy, right? No, because if you're going to speak on a science and try to refute it, you should be as familiar and precise as you can possibly be, okay?
And they show up in this 6 million year period in the fossil record, but when you go back through the lower strata, where you would expect to see transitional forms,
everything's a transitional form,
or simpler versions of those different organisms, they can't find them.
They actually have found pre-Cambrian fossils quite a bit. We actually have microfossils of like single-celled organisms. Sorry, I have a let me rotate my computer so you can see it. I have a pair of mantises that I'm trying to get to mate, and I'm just keeping an eye on them. The male's trying to like mate with the female, now he's trying to connect with her. It tends to be a fairly aggressive species, so I'm just trying to make sure I have a limited number of males. I just want to make sure that he gets his job done and doesn't get murdered in the process. I had a couple of males that became adults and dropped dead. Sometimes that happens. It's not like a totally unsurprising thing, but it does, put a dent in how many males I have available for this sort of thing. But anyway, back to this.
It's as if these organisms just showed up all of a sudden.
No, what happened was the conditions for fossilization became ripe, and the organisms were more able to be fossilized than previous groups that were softer. Hard parts fossilized better than soft parts and things like that. That's what happened.
Without any simpler forms or any evolution of any kind
No, we found simpler forms beforehand.
happening prior to that. And there's far too many organisms in this Cambrian explosion. It's not like we see two organisms.
I mean, how do you get to that conclusion that there are far too many? Like, do you have a number in your head where if you go above that number, it's too many organisms now? I mean, like, what are you thinking, man?
Exactly. I think it's 18 or something different organisms. There's, if you watch
I think it's more than 18, but whatever.
some of Stephen Meyer's videos, he actually talks in great detail about the Cambrian explosion. But these body plans show up in a really small period of time. This is sometimes referred to as the biological Big Bang.
I don't think I've ever heard it being called a biological Big Bang.
Because of how quickly these things just kind of like show up out of nothing. And they still to this day haven't been able to find it. And Stephen Meyer, in one of his videos, he tells this funny story. I'll try and recount it. He tells this funny story about a Chinese evolutionary biologist from China, right? Communist China.
Okay, really? Do we have to go there? Do we really have to poison the well and say, oh, if they're from communist China, it must mean that there's something corrupt about their science? I just reviewed a paper from Chinese scientists, and there was nothing in there about, like, communism, and there was nothing in there about, atheism or anything like that.
Where you're not allowed to, talk against the government.
Okay, that's not a scientific matter, though.
Shows up at a conference of evolutionary biologists in the United States, and is talking about how the Cambrian explosion was this huge thing that kind of turned evolutionary biology on its head. And he said it takes the tree, right, the common trunk. He says it takes the Darwin's tree and flips it on its head.
There are bottlenecks, there are mass extinction events and things like that, but what we see reflected in the fossil record is not nearly, it's maybe 1% of all the organisms that have ever existed.
And he tells about this one, and this is Stephen Meyer's story, but he tells about this one evolutionary biologist from the United States who stood up and said, aren't you, a little concerned about, refuting evolutionary biology coming from a communist country?
I wouldn't be. It has nothing to do with the government. This is just nonsense.
Where they don't believe in God, right? That was the implication.
There are plenty. Okay. 80% of China practice some kind of folk religion. Okay. I mean, there are religions and, there are plenty of gods and deities and other shit in Chinese folk religions. Okay? The government is atheist, but that doesn't mean that the citizens are. Jesus Christ.
Where they don't believe in God, aren't you afraid you're going to get in trouble? And this Chinese scientist was ready for an argument. He's like, no, I come from, China, where you're allowed to question Darwin, but not the government.
Yeah, so it's a non-issue.
He said, you come from the United States, where you're allowed to question your government, but not Darwin.
I mean, it's a guy making a silly joke, but whatever.
and so it just shows how indoctrinated academia and the public are with regard to Darwinian evolution. Where
No, because hang on a second. Shut up! I don't want that. Okay, so 64% of America accepts evolution, which is very low for a lot of developed countries. Okay. Okay.
it's almost a religion in and of itself, right? That you are a fool if you don't believe in Darwinian evolution. And I look at things like the Cambrian explosion, and I look at things like the lack of transitional forms.
Again, everything is a transitional form.
And even the stuff that they've extrapolated and said is how, like Lucy and Artie and all the rest of them looked, and I go, you're the fool to believe that this stuff is actually what happened, given the utter lack of evidence of these transitional forms and the fact that you need to extrapolate all of this. So I, from a Darwinian evolutionary perspective, remain unconvinced by the evidence. But so we're gonna we'll probably stop it here because I wanna there's a lot to go into next, and if I start, we're gonna be here pretty late.
Let me
Go
ask you a question about
Yeah.
the tree.
Yes, true.
Because in order for a new form to happen, to have these random mutations actually, produce some new characteristic that didn't exist before, like lungs, like breathing.
Where's he going with this?
And then when you try to go down and trace, well, okay, everyone can trace back to their ancestors.
Yes.
But then you have a deal like, okay, well, what about the mammals that live in the ocean? They have all the characteristics of, the
Yes.
swimming and all that, and the fins and all this, but they breathe. So that's a tremendous break in the tree, and they kind of have to put, like, there's no way to get this piece back over to here,
Right.
or a platypus, and some of those things. What did the experts say about those kind of anomalies?
So I would say that it's probably that there hasn't been enough evolutionary time since the emergence of like cetaceans and pinnipeds and things like that. If enough time were allowed to elapse, I'm sure there would be a reversion to things like the lungs becoming gills. Basically, gills evolved first because life evolved in the water, and then life quite a while back, like the Permian period or even before that, that's, what now, 300 million years ago, evolved lungs. And it's only been about 50 million years since, these marine mammals showed up. They need another, 200 plus million years before we can assess whether or not they should have gotten gills back. I mean, let's be fair here, Jesus.
I mean, these you got to think these are random mutations, right? So there's no order, there's no direction, right, other than survival of the animal and adaptation to its environment, right? So there's not really like I would imagine that that there would be fewer kinds because unless it's necessary, unless there's a necessity for the random mutation, then why would we have so many of them? Right?
Oh, I guess you're not quite getting what I'm saying. It's like they have no place to launch back on. Like they have no ancestor up their tree, some of these animals that exist.
But the thing is none of them have an
Right.
ancestor up the tree.
Well, that's true.
They can't find any of the transitional forms, so all of this is assumption, right? So I think they would answer it the same way they answer everything, right? Which is that they'll eventually find those transitional forms.
Hey,
But-
Matt, did they get into the 1953 Miller-Urey experiment about
That's abiogenesis.
the origin of life?
Drew talked about that, and that really has more to do with chemical evolution or the origin
Chemical evolution's not a thing.
of first life, which we're going to cover next time.
Did you see how sophisticated that contraption was at the design?
And
That's because the evidence points to an Earth atmosphere that didn't have some of the chemicals in our air that we have today. And so the only way to have an environment where like the oxygen is lacking and shit like that is to have a device that excludes the oxygen. There's nothing I mean it's a complex device, but there's nothing, there's no trickery going on. That's just the way that, things are. Today we have easier ways of, removing certain chemicals from air, but again, this was in the 50s.
And I would point you back to Drew's sermon on that, where he talked in more depth about the fact that they essentially had a closed environment. They pre-arranged, the chemical elements in such a way that they could force a reaction, and the reaction that they forced wasn't actually what did it produce? An enzyme, I think it was.
It produced, I believe, amino acids or at least amine chemicals. And, it was never really about producing a cell or anything like that. That wasn't what the point of the Miller-Urey experiment even was. And, the Miller-Urey experiment, again, was from the 50s. We've discovered a lot since then.
Amino acids, right? Which are not the same thing as a cell, and we're
Nobody's saying they are.
going to go into the complexity of cells, even single cells, right? Single-celled organisms are
Darwin's black
extraordinarily
box.
complex things. Extraordinarily complex things.
Yeah, Michael Behe wrote about that in Darwin's
Yes.
Black Box.
Yes, exactly. And keep in mind, when Darwinian evolution was proposed, the cell was thought to be a gelatinous blob. They didn't have any idea of mitochondria and DNA and RNA and all of the different, sort of biological machines that were in the cell, which we're going to get into a bunch of those. And then with chemical evolution, we're also going to talk about the fact that random mutation only works, and natural selection only works if the organism survives. What about things like irreducible complexity, right?
Irreducible complexity is not really a thing.
We're going to talk a bit. We're going to talk a bit about that as well when we go through some of that stuff. But what other questions do you guys have?
As far as the Cambrian explosion, where did they find these organisms? Was it different layers of the earth?
Layers of the earth,
Yes.
exactly. So they call it strata. I use the term strata. I kind of assumed everybody knew what that meant, but strata is just the layers of things compounding on one another, and so they can date. The strata. We can argue about the dating methods, but let's just assume that things lower down are older than things higher up. That much I think we can tell. And so they date these layers, so they know about how much time it took for these layers to build up, and so that's how they date the duration and where that layer came from in geologic time. And so what they would expect is that at lower strata, you would find transitional forms for things at higher strata. So the Cambrian explosion happened in one strata, this Cambrian layer of strata.
I mean, it's still 6 million years of time.
And they can't find any transitional forms in lower
They have found a lot of stuff in lower strata, actually.
strata to show the evolution to these different body plans.
Didn't that compel Stephen Jay Gould to come up with the idea of punctuated equilibrium?
Yeah.
Yes, there are some issues with that, but that's not relevant.
Yes.
Another ridiculous,
Yeah, how would they make out with the Grand Canyon, though, which it's the inverse?
Yes.
And
Now-
that causes a real problem.
And one thing I'm not going to do is get into to Noah's flood, which is where you're going. Because then we're going to be here forever.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I look at some of this stuff and just the lack of the evidence of some of this stuff, and
amazing.
and really where we're going to get into things that are really going to be proofs of design, of actual design. And even if you don't believe in God, like when you look at some of the things as you dive into the human genome and as you dive into the cell, it's shocking what you actually see. And that, we talk about in science fiction, we talk about nanobots or nanites or, machines, but they already exist, and they already exist in our bodies. I mean, there are mechanisms that are so small that you can't actually see them, even under a microscope, but we can see the effects of them, and there are actually little machines that are inside our bodies. So
That depends on what we define as a machine.
biological machines that are inside our bodies. And so we'll talk about the origin of first life or chemical evolution, which, by the way, I said this before, Darwin's theory doesn't even try to attempt that.
That's not the point of it. That's why.
And to some of the attempts were some of these experiments they did, which didn't even come close. They didn't even come close. They were only able to build pieces. They weren't able to build the whole. So what else?
Don't most scientists believe in a universal flood?
Depends on the type of scientist.
I don't think so. I think and it's really more archaeologists. And so we'll talk about the flood, I guess, a little bit. But the idea of a worldwide flood, most believe that it was a regional flood. The thing that I find striking is the fact that every ancient culture in every continent of the world has a flood myth.
That's Mostly because ancient cultures, built themselves around fucking riverbeds that were subject to seasonal flooding.
Every single one of them.
Yeah.
They all have their own reasons for it. It's different gods that were angry and brought the flood, right? But if the flood of Noah, that's in the Bible, it covered the whole world. I think that if you look at the different flood myths, they all point to there being a worldwide flood. And then when you look at some of some of the fossil record, almost all of it, even in these places that are not necessarily all that close to ocean, almost all of it, I think 90-some% of it, is marine life.
Yes.
So,
And so when you get into some of that stuff, which again I'm not going to dive hardly at all into Noah's floods. That if you guys are interested, we can do a whole thing on Noah's flood. But I do want to get through the origins of first life. A lot of the biological and honestly machine code that's in our bodies. We're going to go through a few videos, and then so we'll try and get through all of that next time. And then the time after that, we'll have a congregational meeting in between. But the time after that, we're going to get into the creation of the world and the Genesis story, and we're going to go through a few different views. And I'll put a lot of caveats in front of that one, but we'll go through a few different views of that.
We did cover a couple of those when we did archaeology before, Matt.
We did.
So maybe you won't have to go crazy on that.
No, but we'll go through essentially three to 3.5 views on that, and go through it and see where we land. But there was a quote that I wanted to. I thought it was a quote by Robert Jastrow, and it says, "For scientists who have lived, for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream.
Right.
He has scaled the mountains
Oh,
of
sorry.
ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself up over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries."
From God and the astronomers. Yeah,
That's
I read
right.
that.
And I find and this is indicative of the fact that as science marches on, and as we get into things like the human genome, somebody brought out, I forget who it was, talked about junk DNA, which were these parts of DNA that they thought were useless parts of DNA.
Non-coding does not mean useless.
And now they're discovering that a lot of these pieces of what they call junk DNA actually have function for
Yes.
things that they're just now discovering DNA does.
Yes, and that doesn't mean necessarily a flaw of science, it just means progression in science.
And so as science marches on, it actually starts to look more and more like we're not the crazy ones. The band of theologians at the top of the mountain aren't the crazy ones after all.
So Matt, that brings up another thing. So from an overarching question is, can someone who claims to be a believer in Christ believe in evolution?
Yes.
Believe in Darwin?
Theistic.
Can they profess their belief?
So let me answer, and I don't want to jump the gun too much because we are gonna talk about theistic evolution, which I think is different. So if you ask about Darwinian evolution by natural selection through random mutation, which is an unguided, purely natural process, I think that belief is based on the belief that more of an atheistic belief, right?
No. Alright. Yeah, I don't think there's really much left to that, so I think that's where we're gonna end it. Well, shockingly, we did get through that in 5 parts. I did not think we were going to, but I was going on, just how dense the earlier parts of that video were, and then as we, got towards the end, it just kind of devolved into whatever that was. So, I guess I was wrong. That's fine, these things happen. I thank everybody for joining me on this journey. Stay pedantic, stay away from the Atlantic. Yeah. Be romantic if you want. I don't care. We're just here tackling some of these things. So have a good one, y'all.